things I have found difficult over the last, I think this was the third week that I did community meetings. I actually find community meetings more difficult than what I'm about to do. Is making the transition in my head between sharing some of that information and then sort of diving into the Word. So a lot of times I need something to help me make that transition. And so what I want today for that to happen is to just spend a moment in prayer with you, so if you would join me. Lord, as we move through this time together, we're now in this place where we are going to open your Word and listen to what it says. And I just ask, starting with me, that you would open my heart and allow me to speak those things that you give to me that would be of benefit to the rest of this fellowship. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be pleasing to you, O God, my rock and my Redeemer. I pray for the recipient that they would put themselves in a place of humility to receive what it is that you have this day, whatever that might be. That in the end, our experience with you today would be real and powerful and life-altering. So, Lord, with what remains of this time, we ask you to lead and guide us. Be near to us, we pray. In Jesus' name. Well, every week we've been asking the same question. We've been in the book of Exodus, and this series we've been calling From Bondage to Freedom. We've been asking the question on the front end of every service, what would it look like? What would it feel like for me to be free? Free from the things that beset me, that keep me from being the best version of myself. What would it be like if I were free from my anger, from my fear, from my incessant need to be pleasing to everybody around me? What would it be like to be free from my addictions to food and to alcohol and to drugs? What would it be like for me to be free? And the reason I have wanted to repeat this over and over and over with you is that we will rarely make a difficult journey unless we realize that the place we are going to is worth it. And where I'm wanting to lead you to is going to be fraught with a lot of problems along the way, a lot of pitfalls, a lot of obstacles. It will not be easy when you have lived your life in some form of bondage to move towards freedom and live that way. Fear will always, if it has been a resident in your life, it will always knock at your door. If anger has been your issue, there will be many opportunities for you to be angry. As you are journeying from a place of bondage to freedom, you need a clear vision of what it would look and feel like to be free if you're going to stay on the road and get there, lest you lose heart. And so what we've been finding is that at many points along the way, the children of Israel just lose heart. For generations and generations, they were slaves. Their parents were slaves. Their parents were slaves. It's all they really knew. And so most of the time when they hit a hard spot, they just were afraid. Is that really true with any of you today? When you just hit a hard spot, you just get afraid. Afraid of the unknown. Afraid of where you're headed, where you're going, what you're going to look like when you actually get there. And so sometimes things like fear, they paralyze us. They paralyze us from moving forward and moving into the places that God has for us. And so last week, as we're making our journey, we stopped at the mountain of God, Mount Horeb, or Mount Sinai. The children of Israel had been traveling between 2 and 3 months, and they arrived at this place. It was actually the place where Moses got his first revelation from God, the burning bush. He'd come full circle back to that place, and we talked last week about his 3 trips back up and down the mountain. And we talked a little bit about what those interactions with God was like. And what we see in this place is that the children of Israel are going to stay there for almost a year. Okay? And the reason they're going to stay there is because God is going to give them instruction He's going to give them insight. He's going to give them wisdom. And in order for them to actually be free, their minds, their thoughts are going to have to be different. Because it is one thing when someone liberates you. It is another thing when you realize that you're free. And so their thoughts are going to have to change. And so God has them there at this place, changing their thoughts, changing their mind, changing their desires. It's going to take a while. It's actually going to take longer than a year, but that's about how long they're going to spend, 11 months. Well, I wanted to go back this week to the third trip that Moses makes going up the mountain. And if you would, you can turn with me to Numbers chapter 24. We're going to look primarily in two places today, Numbers 24 and Numbers 32. This first part in Numbers 24 is the invitation that Moses gets to return back. He's been up twice. He's brought back instruction. He's given them direction. He's helped them to understand what they need to know at this point and how to prepare and consecrate themselves to be in a covenant relationship with God. And then it says in verse 3 of chapter 24, it says, when Moses went and told all the people, this is after he came back down the second time, all of the Lord's words and laws, they responded with one voice. Everything the Lord has said, we will do. Moses then wrote down everything the Lord had said. Now I want you to remember that. Okay? With one voice, everyone said, all that he has given us to do, we will do. Who believes that? No. They had said this earlier. They are repeating their desire to do it again. Okay? Let's skip down to verse 12. Moses is going to be invited by God to come back up the third time. The Lord said to Moses, come up to me on the mountain and stay here, and I will give you the tablets of stone with the law and the commands I have written for their instruction. Then Moses set out with Joshua his aide, and Moses went up on the mountain of God. He said to the elders, wait here for us until we come back to you. Aaron and Hur are with you, and anyone involved in a dispute can go to them. When Moses went up on the mountain, the cloud covered it, and the glory of the Lord settled on Mount Sinai. For 6 days the cloud covered the mountain, and on the seventh day the Lord called to Moses from within the cloud. To the Israelites, the glory of the Lord looked like a consuming fire on top of the mountain. Then Moses entered the cloud as he went up on the mountain, and he stayed on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. Okay. They see this visual representation of the glory of God descending on the mountain, and Moses sort of being swallowed up in the glory of God. I don't know how that feels to you. I don't know what you think about that. But in this place where he is going, the people they have already been given restrictions about how far they can go. But Moses has the freedom to move into a place of closeness with God. And as he is leading Joshua with him, Joshua will stay at a certain point and Moses will go. Now, they are at the bottom. Okay, everybody else is at the bottom of the mountain. And they are watching this from afar. But I would imagine this is a pretty impressive display. They're witnessing the power and the glory of the Lord descending on this place and Moses moving into it. And as they watch, I would imagine initially there's some sense of awe. But then as time passes and they wait and they wait and they wait, that awe turns to a very different kind of spirit. They are going to go back to the people that they have been. They are not going to move forward. They are not going to express faith. They are not going to believe that God is doing a significant work, giving to Moses all that they need. They are going to doubt that Moses is even still alive, that God even still cares. Now, if you were here last week, one of the things that God told his people is that they were one of a few things, right? He was giving them a sense of their identity because all they'd ever known was slavery. And one of the first things that he said to them was that they were his treasured people. Among all the earth, they were his treasured people. That they were a royal priest and a holy nation. They were set apart, right? He was giving them a new identity, but they couldn't but help to revert back to who it is that they had been for years and years and years and years. So Moses goes up, they're at the bottom. He's having this encounter. He's going to bring back the commandments on the tablets, on the stone, and there they are at the bottom. Now I'm going to skip to chapter 32 and listen at what happened with them. But before we read that text, or at least part of that text, here's what I want you to ask yourself.
Vince, you said it was Numbers 24 before it's Exodus.
Okay, sorry. Sorry about that, guys. Here, we're still in Exodus. Sorry about that. Thank you, darling. Okay, so as you're about to hear this passage, I want you to ask yourself the following question. Do I ever get tired of waiting on God? And the second question, when I do, what do I tend to do? See, oftentimes we find ourselves in a place where we are waiting for God to give us something we don't have, or to lead us to a place we want to go. Some of us in this room are incredibly lonely. We long for companionship that we don't have. And we wonder how long it's going to be until God brings that someone into our life. And we wait, and we wait, and we search the skies, and we wonder, where are you, God? What are you doing? You know my heart. You know my desires. And still I wait. There's some of us here who have been battling addictions. And you're doing everything you know to do, but you still are wrestling with the same stuff that you've been wrestling with for months and even years. And you're hoping for a little more help from God. And yet you find yourself still waiting. Waiting to move into some new place. There's some of you who are without work these days. You wonder, well, how much longer can I be without work? How am I going to make it? How long do I have to wait until you provide for me in this way? See, a lot of us find ourselves in places along our journeys where we're having to wait. And so when you get in touch with what that feels like, you might appreciate the response of the Israelites. Because at first glance, they just look like a bunch of fools. And you think to yourself, how could they possibly do that? How could they forget going through wet places on dry ground? How could they forget when God gave them sweet water from bitter? How could they forget God raining manna from the sky? How could they forget this massive quail migration 3 feet deep? How could they forget? How could they forget when Moses struck the rock, water coming from it? How could they forget? But when you're in that place of waiting, your memory sort of fails you. It's hard to remember the places along the way where God did good stuff. All you can really see is where you are. And so I want to ask you, what is it that you tend to do when you find yourself waiting longer than you really wanted to wait? And as you ask yourself that question, I want you to listen with me to Exodus chapter 32. Because all of us grow weary of waiting. Exodus 32, beginning with verse 1. When the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and they said, "Come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him." As for this fellow Moses? Really? After all he had done, now this fellow Moses who? Yahoo, Yahweh, no way. Give us another God. Why do they want another God? Because their current God isn't performing for them at the rate at which they would like. They're tired of waiting. Yeah, they liked the fireworks and the display. It sort of freaked them out. They were impressed by it. But now all they feel is just that desire to have direction, to have understanding, to know what their next step is. And all they find themselves doing is just waiting. And so while they're waiting, what they decide to do is to make new gods and choose a new leader. And Aaron doesn't have the integrity of his brother. He's the older brother. But he's missing something. Because if Aaron were a little more like Moses, he wouldn't have so quickly responded in the way that he did. But let's listen to what Aaron does. Verse 2. Aaron answered them, "Take off the gold earrings that your wives, your sons, and your daughters are wearing, and bring them to me." So all the people took off their earrings, and they brought them to Aaron, and he took what they handed him, and made it into an idol, and cast it in the shape of a calf, fashioning it with a tool. Then they said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." Really? I mean, really? Like, Aaron goes into like the wood shop or whatever, and he makes this calf, and now they're going to ascribe everything that had happened to them, their freedom, their identity, their security, their provision, in this little molten, glob of earrings. Aaron didn't at one time say, "Hey, how about we just be a little patient here?" He could have reminded them about all the things that God had done for them, right? There are hundreds of ways that Aaron could have responded in this moment. He could have said, "Listen, Moses has gone back up and down the mountain, a couple times previously. He's brought us the word of the Lord. We've seen God's hand on our lives. Let's just be patient. Let's just hang in there. Why don't we, instead of focusing on what we don't have, let's just be grateful that we're not making bricks out of mud and straw anymore." Could we just for a moment, while we wait, show a little patience? Could we just, while we wait, not focus on what we don't have, but be grateful for what we do? Could we do that for just a few more minutes? But Aaron says, "No, just go get all your jewelry, get the gold, we'll figure it out." And he makes an idol. And they attribute all of their success to this point to this thing that Aaron just made. It seems crazy, but it's not that far-fetched. I'll tell you later. Verse 5. When Aaron saw this, he built an altar in front of the calf, and he announced, "Tomorrow there will be a festival to the Lord." So the next day the people rose early, and they sacrificed burnt offerings, and they presented fellowship offerings. And after which they sat down to eat and drink, and they got up to indulge in revelry, which aka means sex. Okay? Now, in this passage here, we know that Aaron took the gold and he shaped it in the form of a calf, and the calf became basically their god. Okay, this was an idol. Now, they've already broken the first two commandments. Of the top 10, they've already broken the first two. "Thou shalt have no other gods before me, and thou shalt make no graven images." Moses has not even back down the mountain. It's only been 40 days, right? And they've already broken the top. Now, do we remember in Exodus chapter 24 what the people said? "Everything you have told us to do, we will do." Well, how about no other gods before him? It's been 40 days. Sometimes 40 days feels a lot longer than 40 days, doesn't it? Don't judge them. Understand them. Relate with them. Be honest with yourself. And understand that idols can come in many different shapes and sizes. And when your God is not cooperating with the plan that you have for your life, it's very easy to make a new one. It's very easy to give your heart to someone else over and above God, isn't it? It's not hard. It actually happens pretty easily when you don't find your sense of identity and security rooted in the relationship you have with God. If you are an insecure person, you will find yourself often looking for security and identity in a variety of different places. You might not call it idolatry, but that's what the Bible calls it. And that's what's happening here. They're afraid that Moses is dead. He made one too many trips up the mountain. He's not going to make his way back. They're afraid of the God who had come and thundered and shook the mountain with lightning and trumpet blasts. They're afraid of that God. They don't really know that God yet. They're familiar with their idols. By the way, the place that they're heading, Canaan, their promised land, it's filled with a group of people who worship a multitude of different idols, one of which is Baal. Familiar with the idol Baal? Does anybody know by chance what the image used for Baal is? How about a bull? So you see, when they're worshiping this calf, it does something to the heart of God. Because they're ascribing now all of their success, their provision, their deliverance, basically to a God like Baal. And his intent for them was that they would be different. That their chosenness, their set-apartness would make them different. And because they were different, it would draw these idol worshippers to him, the real God, the true God. But now they're just like everybody else. They're just like everybody else. There is no difference. From their places of fear and insecurity, they choose a different God. And it's not going to set well with Yahweh. We won't get there this week. Next week we'll take a look at it. It's a troublesome passage. We'll get there in a little bit. But for now, just understand that what happens sometimes when you get tired of waiting is that sometimes you can make really bad decisions if your focus and your energies aren't put in the right place. And that's what's happening here. We continue this passage, verse 7. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go down, because your people whom you brought up out of Egypt," excuse me. How many of you guys remember Moses wanted nothing to do with this? Your people whom you, this is like parents when their son or their daughter do something terrible. Go get your son who just, so God is saying, your people whom you brought up, and Moses is like, not my people. A few verses later he's going to say, your people whom you brought up. They're going to go back and forth like an old couple. It says, your people whom you brought up out of Egypt have become corrupt. They have been quick to turn away. 40 days doesn't seem quick, but it does to God, because 1,000 years is as unto a day. Your people, whom you brought up out of Egypt, have become corrupt. They've been quick to turn away from what I commanded them. And they've made themselves an idol, cast in the shape of a calf. They bowed down to it and sacrificed to it, and have said, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. There's a lot of times that we can very easily relate with characters in the Scripture, with Moses, with the children. But I want you for a second to try and relate with God. This is a stretch. But if you're God in this situation, and you have delivered people from bondage, and you have led them by day and night to the place that they are, you have increased your level of intimacy, you are giving them instruction and guidance and wisdom for living a new way, you have prepared a place for them to walk into and to know abundance. And yet, you see this same group of people at every turn grumbling, complaining, moaning, wanting to go back, building new idols, attributing all of their success to them. How would that make you feel? I mean, I know it's God, but God. It'd have to break your heart. This is your treasured possession. This is your called out, special, set apart people. You have great plans for this people to redeem the world through this people. And they're just like everybody else. Sometimes we see God's responses, and we'll see it next week, and we say, wow, that's a bit over the top. But how would you feel? I mean, really? And what would you do? How do you feel when somebody totally breaks your heart? Tramples every good intention you've ever had to make life for them better. How does it feel? Not so hot. So we're going back and forth between understanding the people and understanding God. It's a very unique situation. It's actually, if it wasn't so sad, it's a super funny passage. We'll get there next week because it's just crazy, some of the things that you read. But for now, for today, I want you to think about this. When I get to that place in my life where I grow tired of waiting, anybody been there? There now? What do I tend to do? This is going to be very important because what we tend to do while we wait will determine who it is that we become and where it is that we go. What we do while we wait will determine who it is that we become and where it is that we go. And so, I wonder if while we're waiting for that special someone, for that deliverance from the addiction, for that job, for that home, for that fill in the blank, I wonder if we tend sometimes to forget all of the ways in which God has brought us to the place that we are now. If we forget that time when God brought us through wet places on dry ground, we forget that time when we didn't know where the money was going to come from, but somehow like manna from the sky came and it was provision enough for the day. Maybe we wanted more, but it was enough for the day. God at every turn was in supernatural ways providing for these people and drawing them to Himself, but they got to this place where they just forgot all that. Because the need that was in front of them was so great, it superseded their memory. And so when you hit this waiting place, I want to say to you, don't forget everything that came before where you find yourself now. Because this chapter in your life, if you're waiting and wanting, won't be the final chapter. You won't be here forever. I think proportionately to the time as you are waiting to move to the next space, you will decrease your waiting time if your response to the situation is a redemptive response rather than a response that leads you away from what it is that God is calling you to. The children of Israel didn't have to wander around for 40 years until a generation of people who didn't believe died out. They didn't have to. That wasn't God's plan. God wanted, He did take them on a roundabout way, but He didn't intend for it to be that long. It's just that some people never got there. Their choices shaped their character. Their character shaped their destiny. And the same could be said for you and me. Sometimes we tend to forget. Sometimes we grow impatient, and sometimes we focus on the things that are not as they should be, or not as we want them to be, and we complain. Everybody loves to be around complainers, don't they? The next time you think about complaining about where you are and what's going on in your life, I just want you to remember what it feels like when somebody else is doing that to you. And then I want you to ask yourself the question, why am I complaining? Of what value does this serve me in any way? If I were to say to you, yes, the rate at which you complain speeds up the process of your getting out of where you, then by all means complain. It compounds the problem. It makes it worse. So sometimes when we hit that spot, we not only get amnesia, but then we focus on all that is wrong. We can't see the larger picture. And we fixate on that and we complain. And we become miserable, not only to the people around us, but to ourselves. We become miserable people as we wait. And then sometimes, as is the case here with the children of Israel, sometimes we go our own way. We get tired of waiting for so long that we just choose a different God. We do. We give our affections and our heart. We give first place in our life to someone or something else. Thou shalt not have any other gods before me. And I wonder, as we're all probably in a place of waiting, if that's not occurring in our lives as well. It's so easy to look at and make judgment on what appears to be a group of fools, ungrateful fools, until we look in the mirror and we realize that shaping that calf isn't really all that much of a stretch for some of the things that we've done when we've been waiting longer than we wanted. I just want to say to you that if we're going to be free, like really free, it is going to require a little bit of patience. Because you didn't get like you are overnight. And while God does sometimes do supernatural, miraculous deliverances in a moment, and I love it when He does, more often than not, what God tends to do is work with us and process with us until we get to a place where our desires change. And as our desires change and our thoughts change, our behaviors change, and we find that as we've been walking down this road before long, that we are free. And it happened without our even knowing when. There were no trumpets blaring, there were no great celebrations, at least down here. But somewhere along the way, when you've been walking in the same direction, along obedience in the same direction, what you will find is that you are free from the old things that used to paralyze you, the fears and the anger and the bitterness and the addictions and the other things that you give your heart to. But it just requires a little bit of patience. And so here's what I want to say to you guys who are waiting. Rather than losing heart, rather than forgetting, rather than complaining, rather than giving your heart to something or someone else, here's maybe what I would recommend doing while you're waiting. First thing I would recommend is to reflect back on everything that has gotten you to the point where you are. And remember that God has been with you at every step along the way. There are many places along the way that it could have gone really, really worse than it has. He has blessed you and He has carried you because you are His treasured possession. And so while you're waiting, maybe if you could just remember, if you could just look back and attribute to God those things that have been so richly blessed in your life, it might begin to help you deal with the waiting in a little bit better way than you've been able to. And while you're remembering, if you could maybe just generate a list of those things and be grateful for them and give thanks for them. Because what I've found in my life is that the more grateful I am, the more grateful I am. It's true. The more complaining and grumpy I am, the more of that I am. See, it only makes sense. What you fix your mind and your thoughts on, ultimately your heart becomes seized by those things. And your life becomes filled with those things that you fill it with. And so, as you're reflecting back on your life, maybe just remember about the ways in which God has brought you to where He has. Hasn't always been a perfect journey, I totally get that. There have been a lot of places along the way that you've been angry and afraid and frustrated and wanted God to do it different. Believe me, in my mind and in my heart, I would have carved out my journey way different than what God has done. But when I'm in my right mind, and when I'm waiting on what it is that I want for God to give me, I found it best just to reflect on the ways in which He has brought me to this place and give thanks. Because it shapes who I am. And it shapes where I'm going. I think if the children of Israel would have really locked onto this, their trip would have been a whole lot shorter. But God was trying to work out 400 years of slavery, and it just took them a long time. And some people never got it. And they died out there in the wilderness. They never made it to the promised land. And so, as you're waiting and watching for God, who seems distant these days, I just want to encourage you not to lose heart. I know for some of you, you're lonely. I know for some of you, you have no idea how you're going to pay the bills. I know for some of you, you wonder if you can make it another day in dealing with the addictions that have so become a stronghold in your life. I get all that stuff. And I know you have, as you've prayed and waited, you've searched the sky and hoped that God would do something supernatural to deliver you. I really have a strong belief that He wants you to participate in this process. We don't pray to God so that He zaps us and just does what He can do. We got to work with God. And so I think as we're journeying towards freedom, there's some part in us that needs to stop complaining. That needs to stop forgetting. That needs to stop every time we hit a hard spot going back. That needs to stop creating gods and making idols and putting things ahead of God. There's something in us as we're walking towards this place that needs to be worked out in us. And it can be. The question is, will it be? What would it be like to really be free? I hope you get a real clear picture of that. It's one of the only things that's going to keep you on track when you're dealing with years and years of what you've been dealing with. So as you watch and you wait, approach your waiting time differently. I think it will make all the difference. I really do. Because as you change, as your mind and your thoughts change, you become free. You're not a slave to your circumstances. God will give you a wilderness song to sing no matter what your circumstances are. And it'll come from a place of authenticity because you believe it. And that's what I want for you. That's what I want for us. As you watch and you wait, change your response to the time that you wait. And watch and see what God will do. Okay. Next week we're going to go and finish this story, and then we're going to go to Exodus 33. It's one of the most beautiful pictures in this whole journey of Moses. Moses takes quite a journey himself. Just a hard, angry man who God works with, who ultimately is willing, a picture like Christ, to lay his life down. The only thing he really wants in his life when we get Exodus 33 is for God's presence to be with him. He doesn't even care about the promised land anymore. He really doesn't. He basically says to God, if you won't go with me, I'm not going. All I really want is you to be with me. And when we get to that place, then we will know we have arrived, no matter where we are. That's where we're headed next week. If you will, pray with me, and then we're going to share communion. Father, we're looking at your word, and we're listening to our lives, and we're seeing things that we need to see. And with no condemnation, we open our hearts to you, and we're asking you as we wait for the very thing we feel we most deeply need and desire. We're asking you to help us wait with grace, to remember place in our life to not put anything ahead of you. To humble ourselves and to be grateful for what has been, for what is, and what will be. And as we do, we look forward to the way in which you will free us to be the best versions of ourselves, your treasured possession. In Christ we pray.